The Groom of the Stool. In the glittering court of Henry VIII, power wasn't measured by bloodlines. It was measured by proximity to the royal posterior. Today's story is all about the Groom of the Stool, the man who wiped the king's bottom and controlled the fate of queens. This is history where loyalty stinks, survival is slippery, and even the softest cloth can carry the weight of a nation. Thomas is fictional, but his job was real. This could have happened. Welcome to The Groom of the Stool by Kerry Clark. Chapter 1. The Throne Behind the Throne. The smell was biblical. Thomas Piers knelt behind the velvet-draped screen. A silver basin poised in one hand, a dampened cloth of Flemish linen in the other. The King of England, defender of the faith, and self-appointed head of the church groaned like a dying ox. "God's wounds, Piers?" Henry barked, his voice strained. "What did we eat yesterday?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Your Majesty enjoyed 3 courses of venison, a swan stuffed with 4 doves, half a boar's head, and 17 different sweetmeats sent by the French ambassador." Another grunt from the royal stool, followed by a splatter that made Thomas wince. The king's diet consisted primarily of meat and megalomania, neither of which passed easily through the royal digestive tract. "Ah, feels like the ambassador himself is passing through me," Henry said with a laugh that turned into a grunt. "Is there blood, Piers? Check for blood." Thomas dipped his head. "At once, Your Majesty." This was his domain, this screened alcove within the king's privy chamber, where the most intimate of royal functions took place. The Groom of the Stool was more than a servant. He was the keeper of secrets that would make even Cardinal Wolsey blush. The only man in England trusted to approach the royal posterior with both cloth and discretion. When Henry finished, Thomas stepped forward, eyes carefully averted as he presented the cloth. The king took it with a grunt. "The chamber pot, Piers. Let me see." Thomas proffered the silver vessel, positioning it so the light from the nearby window illuminated its contents. Henry VIII, the most feared monarch in Christendom, peered at his own excrement with the scrutiny of an alchemist studying gold. "Dark today. Too dark," Henry frowned. "The physicians say darkness means melancholy bile. Write it in the book." "Yes, Your Majesty." Thomas recorded it in the leather-bound journal that tracked the king's bodily functions. It was a text more closely guarded than the royal treasury. Henry rose, allowing Thomas to adjust his undergarments and elaborate robes. It was an intimacy that wives didn't share, that princes couldn't buy. "Who awaits us today?" Henry asked, straightening his massive frame. "Ambassador Chapuis seeks audience regarding the Spanish concerns by Your Majesty. Master Cromwell has papers requiring your seal. And..." Thomas hesitated, knowing how volatile the king had been lately. "The Duke of Suffolk mentioned stopping by with news of the Queen's household." At the mention of Queen, Henry's face darkened. Anne Boleyn, once the obsession that had driven him to break with Rome, was now merely the Queen, and even that title seemed to sour on the royal tongue. "Tell Suffolk I'll see him after dinner. Cromwell can wait until the accounts are settled." "And Chapuis?" Henry paused, patting Thomas's shoulder in the familiar way that still made the groom's heart swell with pride. "Tell Chapuis I had a revelation upon my stool this morning, that perhaps Spain understands England's position better than they let on." Thomas nodded, memorizing the exact wording. As Groom of the Stool, his duties extended far beyond the royal excretions. He was unofficial secretary, confidant, and keeper of the monarch's most intimate moments. He scheduled the king's day, controlled access to the royal presence, and even managed the privy purse, the king's personal funds. "And Piers," Henry added, already moving toward the door where his outer circle of attendants waited. "Have someone bring me candied ginger. My stomach still feels like a battlefield." "At once, Your Majesty." The king swept through the door, instantly surrounded by courtiers and petitioners. Thomas remained behind, carefully wrapping the chamber pot's contents for the royal physicians to examine later. The smell was ghastly, but Thomas had long ago trained himself not to flinch. In the Tudor court, proximity to the throne, even its basest functions, was power. And Thomas Piers, son of a yeoman farmer from Kent, had risen to become the second most important man in England. The first, of course, was Henry himself. Thomas allowed himself a small smile as he sealed the container and placed it in the cedar chest designated for the physicians. Not bad for a commoner whose father had taught him to read solely so he could manage the sheep accounts. Outside the privy chamber, the court of Henry VIII teemed with life and intrigue. Ladies in French hoods and gentlemen in slashed doublets navigated the complex dance of Tudor politics. Pages scurried with messages. Servants balanced platters of food, and musicians strummed gentle melodies from the gallery. Thomas moved through this world with quiet confidence. Courtiers nodded deferentially as he passed. This plain-faced man in simple but fine clothes who could whisper directly into the king's ear, or wipe his royal behind. Both activities granted him extraordinary privileges. "Master Piers," called a silky voice. Thomas turned to find Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, beckoning from an alcove. Cromwell, a butcher's son who'd risen even higher than Thomas, wore his usual expression of calculated inscrutability. "Master Secretary," Thomas acknowledged, stepping into the shadowed recess. "His Majesty will review your papers after his midday meal." "Excellent. And how is our sovereign lord this morning? In good humour?" Thomas knew what Cromwell was really asking. The king's moods dictated policy more reliably than any council meeting. "His Majesty's humours are," Thomas chose his words carefully, "somewhat bilious today. The Spanish matter weighs on him." Cromwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "I see. And has he spoken of the Queen?" "Not directly." Thomas kept his face neutral. Anne Boleyn's position was getting more precarious by the day. Her failure to produce a living son had turned the king's passionate love to simmering resentment. "Be watchful, Piers. Record everything, especially regarding her behaviour." Thomas nodded, though unease prickled at the base of his spine. "As always, I serve His Majesty with complete fidelity." As Cromwell extracted himself with a tight smile, Thomas continued through the bustling palace. This was his domain as much as the screened stool, these hallways where whispers carried and secrets were traded like currency. Every conversation that reached the king was filtered through his groom. Every royal decision was witnessed by the man who handled his most intimate moments. Thomas had never sought power. He'd simply wanted security, a position in a great household, regular meals, perhaps a small pension in his old age. But fate and Henry's bowels had conspired to elevate him far beyond those modest ambitions. As he rounded the corner toward the kitchens to arrange the king's ginger, a court lady brushed past, leaving the distinct scent of rosewater in her wake. Thomas recognized her as one of Queen Anne's attendants, Mary Shelton, if memory served. "Master Piers," she murmured, dropping a curtsy that displayed a generous portion of her décolletage. "Might I have a moment?" "I am rather occupied with the king's business, Lady Shelton. The Queen merely wonders if His Majesty might visit her chambers tonight." "She has." The lady lowered her voice. "She has news she believes will please him." Thomas kept his expression neutral. Anne Boleyn had been making such claims for months now, hints of pregnancy that never materialized, promises of sons that remained daughters or bloody miscarriages. "I shall ensure His Majesty receives your message." The lady pressed a folded note into his palm, her fingers lingering against his. "The Queen would be most grateful for your discretion." As she glided away, Thomas tucked the note into his sleeve without looking at it. He had become a hub for such communications, notes and whispers and promises, all flowing through the man who wiped the king's bottom. The irony wasn't lost on him. In a court obsessed with lineage and divine right, Power ultimately clung to the man closest to the royal bodily functions. The closer you are to the throne, his predecessor had told him, the more you smell it. Thomas had learned to breathe through his mouth years ago. By sundown, he had arranged the king's evening schedule, recorded the day's expenditures in the privy purse accounts, and conferred with the royal physicians about Henry's digestive complaints. Now he waited in the privy chamber as Henry finished a private dinner with several favoured companions. When the king finally retired to his bedchamber, Thomas was there to help remove the elaborate clothing, the doublet stiff with jewels, the hose that bit into Henry's increasingly swollen legs. He worked silently alongside the esquires of the body, the king's other intimate attendants, as they prepared Henry for sleep. Only when the others had been dismissed did Thomas produce Lady Shelton's note. "From the Queen's household, Your Majesty." Henry took it with a grunt, breaking the seal and scanning the contents. His face revealed nothing. "She claims to be with child again," he said finally, crumpling the paper. "Joyous news, Your Majesty." Thomas offered cautiously. "Is it?" Henry's blue eyes, still startlingly bright in his increasingly florid face, fixed on Thomas. "We've heard this tale before. God's will must prevail in all things," Thomas murmured. "Indeed." Henry tossed the crumpled note into the fire. "But one begins to wonder about God's will regarding our marriage. A king needs sons, Piers." "Yes, Your Majesty. You've served me faithfully for 4 years now. You've seen my most private moments." Thomas bowed his head. "It is my greatest honor. Tell me then, you who know my body better than any physician, do you believe there is something amiss with me? Some defect that prevents me from siring healthy sons?" The question hung in the air like poison. Thomas felt sweat break out along his spine. The wrong answer might cost him his position, or worse. "Your Majesty is the very model of manly vigor," he said carefully. "Has not Your Majesty already proved your strength, as the noble Duke of Richmond bears witness? If there is any failure, it cannot possibly lie with you." Henry nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied. "That is our thinking as well. Yet still we have no prince." Thomas recognized the dangerous current beneath the conversation. If the fault wasn't Henry's, it must lie elsewhere, with Anne. "Perhaps this time God will smile upon Your Majesty," Thomas offered. "Perhaps." Henry settled into his bed, gesturing for Thomas to extinguish all but one candle. "But we find our patience wears thin, Piers. Very thin indeed." As Thomas bowed and backed toward the door, Henry added, "We shall visit the Queen tonight, after all. Record that in your little book. And tomorrow." His voice hardened. "Tomorrow we shall speak more of this matter." "Yes, Your Majesty. God grant you peaceful rest." Outside the royal bedchamber, Thomas leaned against the wall for a moment, heart hammering. The king's bodily functions he could handle with clinical detachment. But these political waters were treacherous. One misstep, and he'd drown alongside whoever else displeased Henry. In his small chamber adjacent to the king's apartments, Thomas carefully recorded the day's events in his official journal. Next to the notation about the king's dark stool, he added, "His Majesty visited the Queen's chambers after expressing doubts about her claimed condition." He stared at the words, knowing they might someday be evidence in matters far beyond his control. With a sigh, he closed the book and locked it in his personal chest. Then he knelt by his bed to pray, not just for his royal master's health, but for his own continued survival in a court where even the man who wiped the king's arse could find himself on the wrong end of an executioner's sword. Chapter 2. Bloody Duties. The next 3 months unfolded like a slow-moving nightmare. Anne Boleyn's latest pregnancy ended in miscarriage, a bloody, tragic affair that Thomas documented in his leather-bound journal. "The fetus," he noted as the royal physicians whispered in horrified tones, had been male. Henry had raged for days. His bowel movements became explosive, violent things that left Thomas gagging despite years of practice. The groom recorded each one faithfully, noting color and consistency alongside the king's increasingly volatile moods. "A curse," Henry had muttered one morning as Thomas cleaned up yet another foul discharge. "We are cursed in this marriage." Thomas knew better than to respond. He simply bowed his head and continued his work, the warm cloth passing over royal skin with practiced efficiency. But the whispers had already started throughout the court. Anne had failed, not just once, but multiple times. Worse, she had lost a son. In a court obsessed with omens and divine will, this was damning evidence. Thomas watched the factions realign with the calculating detachment of a man who had survived multiple Tudor court upheavals. Cromwell, once Anne's ally, now avoided her. The conservative faction, those who had remained loyal to Catherine of Aragon, sensed opportunity. And in the shadows waited Jane Seymour, fair, demure, and conspicuously fertile-looking. The king's body told the story that his words did not. When Anne was mentioned, his bowels tightened painfully. When Jane Seymour served him at dinner, Henry's digestion improved noticeably. Thomas recorded it all. Each royal function, each complaint, each moment of relief. The body never lied, even when couched in the language of divine right and royal prerogative. The king passed a motion of surprising ease after receiving a letter from Mistress Seymour. He wrote in mid-April. Color normal, consistency firm. 1 week later, everything changed. Thomas was supervising the cleaning of the royal chambers when Mark Smeaton, a court musician known for his vanity and loose tongue, was arrested. Within days, several gentlemen of the king's privy chamber followed, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. Thomas watched with increasing dread as the machinery of Tudor justice cranked into motion. He had witnessed this before, during the fall of Cardinal Wolsey and the executions of the Carthusian monks who opposed the king's religious reforms. But this was different. This targeted the Queen herself. "Piers," Cromwell said one evening, cornering Thomas as he inventoried linens for the royal household. "His Majesty requires your particular service." Thomas straightened, clutching his inventory book like a shield. "I am, as always, at His Majesty's disposal." Cromwell's thin lips approximated a smile. "Indeed. His Majesty values your discretion and your testimony." "My testimony?" "Regarding the Queen's behavior. You are privy to the King's most intimate moments. Surely you've observed His Majesty's difficulties in fulfilling his marital duties?" Thomas felt cold sweat break out along his spine. "I observe many things, Master Secretary, but interpret very few." "A wise policy." Cromwell placed a heavy hand on Thomas's shoulder. "But wisdom must sometimes yield to duty. The king believes his marriage has been cursed, or worse, that witchcraft has been employed against his person." "Witchcraft?" Thomas couldn't keep the shock from his voice. "The impotence that afflicts him when with the Queen but vanishes in other circumstances." Cromwell let the implication hang. "Surely you've noted this in your records." Thomas thought of his journal entries, the careful notations of royal digestion, of moods, of physical complaints. He had never explicitly mentioned the king's occasional inability to perform with Anne, but the pattern was there for anyone who knew how to read between the lines. "My records concern His Majesty's health, not his marital relations," Thomas said carefully. "Indeed. And yet, as one responsible for the royal person's most intimate care, you've undoubtedly heard His Majesty's private lamentations, his frustrations." Thomas remained silent. Cromwell sighed. "The king requires a loyal servant's confirmation of what he already knows to be true, that the Queen has failed in her most basic duty, that she has been unnatural in her demands." "Unnatural?" "Perverse," Cromwell clarified. "Unwomanly. Positions and activities that no virtuous female would suggest." Thomas felt slightly ill. He had indeed heard Henry's drunken boasts in the early days, of Anne's French learned tricks, of positions that no proper English wife would know. Back then, Henry had gloried in her sophistication. Now, it seemed, those same acts would condemn her. "I have not witnessed such things directly," Thomas said. "But you've heard His Majesty speak of them?" Cromwell pressed. "In his private moments? When his guard is down?" Thomas hesitated. Lying to Cromwell was dangerous, but so was confirming allegations he knew to be twisted beyond recognition. "I have heard His Majesty express disappointment in recent months," he said finally. "Frustration at the Queen's failures." Cromwell nodded as if this confirmed everything. "You'll be called to sign a statement. Nothing elaborate. Simply your observations as a loyal servant concerned for your master's well-being. And if I were to decline," Cromwell's face hardened, "that would suggest a concerning loyalty to someone other than your king. His Majesty would question who else might command such devotion from the man who handles his most private matters." The threat was unmistakable. Thomas had risen high, but he could fall just as quickly, and being suspected of loyalty to Anne Boleyn now was tantamount to treason. "I am, as always, His Majesty's faithful servant," Thomas said, the words tasting like ashes. "Excellent." Cromwell produced a folded document from his sleeve. "Review this statement. If it accords with your recollections, your signature will be required tomorrow." Thomas took the paper with numb fingers. As Cromwell departed, he unfolded it with trembling hands. The statement described a king bewitched by an unnatural wife, a woman who had suggested acts against nature and God's law, and who had laughed at His Majesty's occasional difficulties. It was monstrous, and yet there was just enough truth embedded in the lies to make it plausible. Henry had complained of Anne's sharp tongue, her mockery when he couldn't perform. He had lamented her foreign ways. But context transformed these private grumblings into something sinister. That night, Thomas knelt longer than usual at his prayers. He begged God for guidance, for some path that would preserve both his life and his soul. But dawn came without divine intervention. The next day, with a hand that only slightly trembled, Thomas Piers, Groom of the Stool to Henry VIII, signed a statement condemning Anne Boleyn for acts he had never witnessed. His signature joined dozens of others, courtiers, servants, even ladies from Anne's own household, each one a small betrayal, each one a nail in her coffin. His reward came swiftly, a purse of £20, a new doublet of crimson velvet, and the king's hand upon his shoulder, heavy with approval. "You've served us well, Piers," Henry said, his face flushed with what might be fever or might be excitement. A true friend reveals uncomfortable truths. Thomas bowed deeply. "I live only to serve your Majesty." "Indeed you do." Henry's blue eyes, once keen as a hawk's but now buried in folds of flesh, assessed him. "Which is why we've decided to grant you a new title, alongside your current duties, Keeper of the Royal Records." It was a significant promotion, one that brought additional income and status. It also made Thomas the official chronicler of the king's version of events. "I am overwhelmed by your Majesty's generosity," Thomas murmured. "Loyalty deserves reward," Henry said dismissively. "Now, help me prepare. We hunt at Windsor tomorrow." As Thomas helped the king change into his hunting clothes, he noticed Henry seemed lighter, almost jubilant. The dark mood that had plagued him for months had evaporated. That night, Thomas added a new entry to his journal. His Majesty passed a motion of extraordinary ease. Color healthy, consistency perfect. The king remarked that he feels unburdened of a great weight. He did not add what they both knew, that the weight was Anne Boleyn, who even now awaited trial in the Tower of London. 2 weeks later, Thomas stood among the witnesses as Anne knelt on the scaffold at Tower Green. He had been commanded to attend, to record for the official chronicles that justice had been done. Anne, dressed in dark grey damask with a crimson kirtle beneath, maintained her composure to the last. Her final speech was dignified, declaring her innocence while acknowledging the king's divine right to judge her. As the French swordsman brought his blade whistling down, Thomas closed his eyes, but he couldn't block out the dull thud or the collective gasp of the crowd. When he opened them again, Anne Boleyn's body lay sprawled upon the black-draped platform, her severed head caught by the executioner's assistant in a cloth of white linen. Thomas thought fleetingly of other linens, those he had used to clean the king after his bodily functions. The cloth in the executioner's hands served a similar purpose, wiping away mess, removing evidence of human frailty. That night, as Thomas recorded the execution in the official chronicle, his hand shook so badly that he blotted the page twice. The king had ordered him to write that justice had been served upon that notorious whore who enchanted our person through witchcraft and ungodly means. Thomas wrote the words as commanded. But in his private journal, the one recording the king's bodily functions, he made a different entry. His Majesty enjoyed exceptional health today. Passed 2 substantial movements between midday and evening. Appetite voracious at dinner. Remarked that he feels 20 again and eagerly anticipates his marriage to Lady Jane tomorrow. He stared at the words for a long moment before adding a personal note, something he had never dared before. The Queen's head fell at a single stroke. Her lips, they say, continued to move in prayer for several seconds after. May God have mercy on us all. Thomas locked both journals away and knelt by his bed. But this time, no prayers would come. Only the memory of Anne's dark eyes, scanning the crowd one final time before she knelt for the blade. Had she seen him there among the witnesses? Had she recognized the man who had signed his name to lies that condemned her? The man who emptied her husband's chamber pot and recorded his every bodily function? Thomas suspected she had. Anne Boleyn had always been observant. Even as her world crumbled around her, she would have noted who stood with Cromwell, who had betrayed her. He wouldn't sleep that night, or many nights thereafter. Chapter 3. The Weight of the Crown. 11 years passed. Thomas Piers remained Groom of the Stool, through 3 more of Henry's marriages. Jane Seymour had died, giving birth to the desperately wanted son. Anne of Cleves had been rejected after a disastrous wedding night that Thomas had documented in clinical detail, His Majesty unable to perform due to the lady's appearance and odour. Catherine Howard had lost her head like her cousin Anne Boleyn, though her crimes had been real enough. Now Catherine Parr managed the increasingly irritable king with capable efficiency, but the king himself had changed drastically. The vital, athletic man Thomas had first served was gone, replaced by a mountain of suffering flesh. Henry could barely walk, his legs swollen with ulcers that wept foul-smelling pus. His waist measured 54 inches. And his digestion, the focus of Thomas's professional attention, had deteriorated catastrophically. "God's wounds!" Henry roared from behind the velvet screen. "It burns like hellfire, Piers!" Thomas knelt with his silver basin and cloth, face impassive despite the stench that would make most men vomit. "The physicians recommended less beef, Your Majesty." "Damn the physicians," Henry growled. "What do they know? Our father ate beef daily and lived to 62. Thomas didn't point out that Henry VII had been a lean, abstemious man, not a behemoth consuming enough food for 3 men at each meal. "Perhaps some poached fish for dinner," he suggested mildly. "With the fennel preparation Your Majesty enjoyed last week?" Henry grunted, the sound transforming into a groan of pain. "Something's torn inside us, Piers. We can feel it." Thomas helped clean the king, noting with professional concern the streaks of blood mixed with the excrement. The physicians had been warning for months about the king's diet and temper. Neither had improved. "We'll consult Master Butts about a new remedy," Thomas promised, helping Henry rise, a process that required 2 additional strong attendants these days. "Butts is a fool," Henry muttered, but without real heat. "They're all fools." As Thomas adjusted the king's clothing, specially designed to accommodate his enormous girth, he noted how Henry leaned heavily against the wall, his breathing labored. "Shall I summon the litter, Your Majesty?" Henry nodded, defeated. The king who had once jousted for hours and danced until dawn now needed to be carried from his privy to his audience chamber. Thomas dispatched a page to fetch the litter bearers, then began his usual post-toileting documentation. This morbid diary had grown increasingly detailed over the years as Henry's health deteriorated. The physicians consulted it daily, searching for patterns in the royal waste that might explain the king's suffering. "Blood again," Thomas wrote. "Dark, mixed throughout. Pain during evacuation severe. His Majesty's colour poor, breathing laboured." He knew what these symptoms portended. The king's massive body was breaking down internally. The man who had dominated England for nearly 4 decades through sheer force of will was being betrayed by his own flesh. Later that day, as Henry conducted state business from a specially constructed throne that accommodated his bulk, Thomas stood discreetly nearby. His position had evolved over the years. No longer just the keeper of the royal bowels, he was now a shadow secretary. He managed correspondence, screened visitors, and filtered information before it reached the increasingly irascible monarch. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, approached with several documents requiring the royal signature. As he bent near the king, his nose wrinkled involuntarily at the smell. Henry noticed. His eyes narrowed dangerously. "Our presence offends you, Archbishop?" Cranmer blanched. "Not at all, Your Majesty. I merely..." "You merely what? Found the stench of your king displeasing?" Henry's voice rose, drawing attention from nearby courtiers. "Perhaps we should apologize for our mortal frame. Your Majesty misunderstands." "Get out!" Henry roared, fat face purpling. "Out!" As Cranmer retreated in confusion, Henry began to cough, a wet, racking sound that shook his massive body. Thomas moved forward smoothly, producing a cloth for the king to spit into. The sputum came streaked with blood. "Shall I adjourn the court, Your Majesty?" Thomas asked quietly. Henry nodded, still coughing. When the latest spasm passed, he wheezed. "Summon Paget with the French treaties. And Catherine. We need her calming presence." As the court emptied, Thomas efficiently dispatched pages to fetch both Secretary Paget and the Queen. He then produced a vial of syrup prepared by the apothecary, a mixture of honey, poppy, and herbs that sometimes eased the king's pain. Henry accepted it gratefully, gulping the sticky liquid. "They all look at us with disgust now, peers," he said bitterly. "Even Cranmer, even our most loyal. Your Majesty's person remains sacred and divinely appointed," Thomas replied diplomatically. Henry gave a short, humorless laugh. "Our person is rotting while we yet live." He gestured to his legs, the bandages visible beneath his hose stained with yellow discharge. "What divine appointment is this? To suffer like Job?" Thomas had no answer. Instead, he produced a small silver box containing candied ginger, one of the few treatments that still provided Henry some relief from his constant indigestion. The king took a piece, sucking it contemplatively. "You alone have shown unwavering loyalty, peers. Through all our marriages, all our difficulties. Never a flicker of disgust upon your face, even at our most vulnerable. It is my sacred duty and honor to serve your Majesty." "Sacred duty," Henry repeated, rolling the words as if tasting them. "Yes, perhaps it is. God appointed us king, and God appointed you to witness our frailty." Thomas bowed his head, unsure how to respond to this theological interpretation of his role wiping the royal ass. "We shall remember your service in our will," Henry continued. "A pension. Land, perhaps. Your Majesty is too generous. Not generous enough, Henry muttered. Then, abruptly changing subjects. Do you ever think of her, Piers? Her, Your Majesty? Anne, the witch. Thomas felt cold sweat break out along his spine. In 11 years, Henry had rarely spoken Anne Boleyn's name. When he did, it was always the concubine or the whore, never Anne. I think only of Your Majesty's well-being, Thomas replied carefully. Diplomatic as always. Henry's blue eyes, sunken now in his swollen face, fixed on Thomas with unexpected sharpness. She went to her death protesting innocence, you know. They all do, of course. But sometimes I wonder. The king trailed off, staring into middle distance. Thomas remained perfectly still. This was dangerous territory. She gave us Elizabeth, Henry continued softly. A clever child. Perhaps too clever. Anne's eyes, exactly. Thomas said nothing, though his heart raced. The king seemed melancholy rather than angry, a mood that could shift without warning. We signed her death warrant, Henry said suddenly. And yours too. Mine, Your Majesty. Thomas couldn't keep the alarm from his voice. Your statement, about her bewitching us, making us impotent. Henry waved a puffy hand. We both know that was a fabrication, convenient for what needed to be done. Thomas felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. After 11 years, to hear the king so casually admit the lies. I signed what I believed to be true, he said stiffly. Did you? Henry's gaze penetrated him. Or did you sign what Cromwell placed before you, knowing your own neck depended on it? Thomas couldn't answer. Both responses were equally dangerous. After a long moment, Henry sighed. It doesn't matter now. Cromwell lost his head too, in the end. As will we all. The conversation was mercifully interrupted by Queen Catherine's arrival. She swept in wearing a gown of deep blue, her manner both respectful and warmly familiar as she took her husband's hand. My dear Lord Husband, you look fatigued. Perhaps we might retire early this evening? Henry's expression softened, as it always did for Catherine Parr. Always caring for our comfort, sweet Kate. Very well. We shall review the French matters in our private chamber. As Thomas helped arrange for the king's litter to be brought, he caught Catherine's concerned gaze. How is he, truly? She murmured when Henry was momentarily distracted. Deteriorating, Your Majesty, Thomas answered quietly. The bleeding increases. The pain as well. Catherine nodded, her expression grim but composed. At 45, she had proven the most capable of Henry's wives at managing both his temper and his declining health. We must prepare for what comes, she said softly. The prince is still so young. Thomas knew she referred to 9-year-old Edward, Henry's only surviving legitimate son and heir. The transition would be perilous for all involved, especially those closest to the current king. Indeed, Your Majesty. Later that night, after helping the king into his massive bed and arranging the 16 pillows required to keep him semi-upright for breathing, Thomas sat alone in his chamber updating the Royal Health Journal. January 15, 1547, he wrote. His Majesty passed 3 bloody motions, pain severe, temperature elevated, confusion noted in evening, with references to past events as if current. Thomas paused, pen hovering over the paper. Should he record Henry's comments about Anne Boleyn? About the false testimony? After a moment's hesitation, he continued. His Majesty expressed remorse regarding past legal proceedings. Mentioned Queen Anne Boleyn by name for first time in many years. Mood melancholy rather than wrathful. He stared at the words, knowing they could implicate him if found after Henry's death. With a sigh, he dipped his pen and added, As groom of the Stool and keeper of the royal records, I have faithfully served His Majesty in all things. recording his words and conditions without interpretation. May God and history judge us all with mercy. Thomas closed the journal and locked it in its special chest. He wouldn't sleep tonight, again. The ghosts of the past seemed too close, stirred up by Henry's unexpected reminiscence. In the flickering candlelight, Thomas examined his hands, hands that had attended the most powerful man in England at his most vulnerable moments. Hands that had signed false testimony condemning a queen. Hands that were neither clean nor altogether filthy, but merely used. Like the rest of him. Chapter 4. The Final Service. By late January 1547, Henry VIII was dying. The entire court knew it, though no one dared speak it out loud. The king's massive body had become a battleground of competing ailments, gout, diabetes, infected ulcers, and most recently, fever that left him alternately shivering and sweating. For Thomas Piers, the deterioration was documented in stomach-turning detail. The royal excretions had become almost entirely blood and pus. The stench from the king's bandaged legs required constant burning of incense in the royal chambers. And Henry's periods of lucidity grew shorter, punctuated by raving delirium. "The ghosts are gathering, Piers," Henry muttered one frigid morning as Thomas changed the soiled sheets beneath him. "Can you see them?" Thomas glanced around the opulent bedchamber, seeing only the usual attendants and physicians hovering at a respectful distance. "There are no ghosts, Your Majesty. Only your loyal servants." "There," Henry insisted, pointing a swollen finger toward the window. "Wolsey in his cardinal's hat, more his colour now than when he lived. And behind him, Thomas More, still carrying his head. Stubborn even in death." Thomas exchanged concerned glances with Dr. Butts, the king's physician. The fever was clearly worsening. "Perhaps some cool cloths for His Majesty's brow?" Thomas suggested. Butts nodded, dispatching an assistant to fetch them. Meanwhile, Thomas continued the grim task of cleaning the king, a process that now required 3 men and a system of ropes and pulleys to lift Henry's immense, ulcerated body. "Anne is there too," Henry whispered, his blue eyes fixed on the middle distance. "Not the Cleves girl, the other one, the sharp one." Thomas felt a familiar chill. Anne Boleyn had featured increasingly in the king's fever dreams. Sometimes Henry cursed her. Other times, like now, he spoke of her with an unsettling wistfulness. "She's wearing green," Henry continued. "Always favoured green," brought out her eyes. "Your Majesty should rest," Thomas said firmly, signalling the other attendants to finish adjusting the king's position. "The council awaits your instructions regarding the French ambassador." This mention of state business seemed to draw Henry back from whatever spectral gathering he'd been observing. His gaze sharpened, focusing on Thomas. "Yes, the French, always scheming." He grimaced as the attendants lowered him against the pillows. "Fetch Hertford. And Surrey, no, not Surrey. We had his head off last week for treason, didn't we?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The poet, Earl of Surrey, had indeed been executed days earlier, another victim of the factional fighting intensifying as Henry's death approached. "Good. Arrogant puppy." Henry coughed, wincing at the pain it caused in his massive torso. "Bring us the treaty draft, and something for this damnable pain." As Thomas dispatched pages to fetch both Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, brother to the late Queen Jane and uncle to the heir, and the requested documents, he noted how the physicians huddled near the door, whispering urgently. Their expressions confirmed what he already knew. The king had days. At most, perhaps only hours. The royal bowels, which had occupied so much of Thomas's professional attention for 15 years, were shutting down. The body that had once seemed the very embodiment of kingship was surrendering to mortality. Edward Seymour arrived promptly, his angular face composed despite the stench in the royal chamber. As uncle to young Prince Edward, Hertford stood to gain enormous power once Henry died. Already he was positioning himself as Lord Protector for the 9-year-old heir, Your Majesty. Seymour bowed deeply. I bring the treaty revisions as requested. Henry gestured impatiently for the documents. As Seymour handed them over, his gaze met Thomas's briefly, a calculating look that made the groom of the stool uneasy. The king reviewed the papers with surprising clarity, considering his condition. He made several annotations, then scrawled his signature with a hand that trembled but remained recognizable. See, it dispatched immediately, Henry commanded. And bring us word of the prince's lessons. Is he progressing with his Latin? Admirably, Your Majesty, Seymour confirmed. His tutors say he shows remarkable aptitude for one so young. Henry nodded, momentarily pleased. Tudor blood tells, though he has his mother's gentleness. As Seymour withdrew with the signed documents, Thomas moved to adjust the king's pillows. Henry seized his wrist with surprising strength. What do they say in the corridors, peers? He demanded. About us, about our condition. Thomas hesitated. They pray for your Majesty's recovery, he said carefully. The entire court keeps vigil. Lies, Henry hissed. They circle like vultures, waiting for the last breath. Hertford, most of all. The Earl serves your Majesty with devotion, Thomas insisted, though they both knew Seymour's true focus was securing his nephew's, and thus his own, position. None of them served us as you have, peers, Henry said, his grip relaxing. None have seen us as you have. The crown weighs heavy, but few understand how heavily it sits upon the body itself. Thomas bowed his head. I have been honoured to attend your Majesty. Honour, Henry laughed, the sound transforming into a wet cough. Is that what you call it? Wiping our royal posterior? Recording our every shit and piss for 15 years? Despite the crude language, there was no malice in the king's tone. Only a strange intimacy, born of their unique relationship. Serving God's anointed in any capacity is honour beyond measure, Thomas replied diplomatically. Henry studied him with unexpected lucidity. You should have been a courtier, peers, not a servant. You have the tongue for it. Before Thomas could respond, the king was seized by another coughing fit, more violent than previous ones. Blood spattered his lips and the white sheets. Thomas moved quickly, supporting Henry's massive shoulders while signalling urgently for the physicians. By the time Dr. Butts reached the bedside, the king had collapsed back against the pillows, face grey beneath his beard. His Majesty requires immediate bleeding, Butts announced, already rolling up his sleeves. And the cupping instruments. Quickly. The next hours passed in desperate activity. The physicians applied hot cups to draw out evil humours, bled the king from both arms, and administered various concoctions meant to purge the body of corruption. Thomas supervised it all, directing servants, fetching supplies, and most importantly, cleaning up the increasingly horrific results of the failed treatments. Henry's bowels, responding to the purgatives, expelled an almost continuous stream of blood and mucus. The stench became so unbearable that even veteran courtiers gagged upon entering the chamber. By evening, it was clear the end approached. Archbishop Cranmer was summoned to administer last rites. The Privy Council gathered in the antechamber. Queen Catherine kept tearful vigil at her husband's side, though Thomas suspected her grief was tempered by the very real fear that she might yet be implicated in some imagined treason before Henry died. Throughout it all, Thomas maintained his position, cleaning, adjusting, recording. The final entries in his journal of the king's bodily functions were almost entirely about blood, its colour, quantity, and the increasing pain each expulsion caused the dying monarch. Near midnight, during a brief period of consciousness, Henry beckoned Thomas closer. "Piers," he wheezed. "The book. Your record of our indignities." "Yes, Your Majesty. Burn it after we're gone." Henry's eyes, clouded with pain but still commanding, fixed on Thomas. "Not for history. Not for physicians. Only you and God should know how a king truly dies." Thomas bowed deeply. As your majesty commands. And peers? Henry's voice dropped to a whisper only Thomas could hear. We were never bewitched by any of them. Remember that. I will, your majesty. Whether this was confession, absolution, or simply delirium, Thomas couldn't tell. But he engraved the words in his memory, perhaps the closest thing to truth he would ever receive about the events that had shaped both their lives. Henry lapsed into unconsciousness shortly thereafter. His breathing grew increasingly laboured, each exhalation rattling in his chest like dice in a cup. In the cold hours before dawn on January 28, 1547, Henry VIII, once the handsomest prince in Christendom, now a mountain of suffering flesh, died. Thomas was wiping blood from the royal thighs when it happened. One moment the king's chest heaved in tortured rhythm, the next, stillness. No final words, no dramatic gestures. Just the cessation of pain that had defined Henry's final years. For a moment, no one moved. Then Archbishop Cranmer stepped forward, making the sign of the cross over the bloated corpse. The king is dead, he intoned. God save King Edward. The physicians began preparing the royal body for embalming, a daunting task given its size and condition. Thomas stood back, suddenly uncertain of his role. For 15 years, his entire existence had revolved around the most intimate needs of the man now lying dead before him. Queen Catherine approached, her eyes red but her composure maintained. Master Piers, she said softly, you have served faithfully to the last. The king spoke often of your discretion and loyalty. Thank you, your majesty, Thomas replied, though he knew Catherine's status as queen would last only as long as the funeral ceremonies. There will be a place for you in my household, she continued, should you wish it. Or I can speak to Hertford about a position with the new king. Thomas bowed, genuinely moved by her thoughtfulness amid her own precarious situation. Your Majesty is most gracious. I shall consider both options with gratitude. But even as he spoke, Thomas noticed how Edward Seymour conferred urgently with several privy councillors, occasionally glancing in his direction. The court was already realigning itself around young Edward VI, or more accurately, around those who would govern in his name. As the royal physicians shooed all but essential personnel from the death chamber, Thomas retreated to his small adjoining room. There, locked in its cedar chest, lay the journal documenting 15 years of Henry VIII's bodily functions, the most intimate record of a king's decline ever compiled. Thomas stared at it, recalling Henry's final command, "Burn it." But should he? The record contained valuable medical information. Future royal physicians might learn from it. And it was, in its way, the most honest chronicle of Henry's reign, a history told not through proclamations and politics, but through the king's own failing flesh. Thomas's contemplation was interrupted by a sharp rap at his door. Opening it, he found 2 of Hertford's guards standing there. Master Piers, the senior guard said stiffly, Lord Hertford requests your immediate presence, and all records pertaining to his late Majesty's final days. So it began already. The new regime wanted control of all information, particularly anything that might contradict whatever narrative they chose to present about Henry's death and final wishes. Of course, Thomas replied smoothly. I shall gather the official chronicles directly. All records, Master Piers, the guard emphasized. Lord Hertford specifically mentioned your private journal of the king's health. Thomas felt cold dread settle in his stomach. How did Hertford know about that? The journal had been for the physician's reference only, and for Henry's private review. I shall bring everything of relevance, he assured them. When the guards stepped back, Thomas closed the door and moved swiftly to the cedar chest. He unlocked it and removed 2 volumes, the official chronicle of the king's activities, carefully sanitized for historical purposes, and a much thinner volume containing bland medical observations suitable for the new regime's eyes. The true journal, 15 years of intimate documentation of Henry's digestive failures, personal complaints, and private confessions, he slipped into his doublet. Henry had commanded him to burn it. Perhaps that had been wisdom rather than vanity. When Thomas arrived at Hertford's temporary command centre in the antechamber, he found barely controlled chaos. Messengers departed to announce the king's death throughout the realm. Councillors argued over the wording of proclamations. Guards were being positioned at strategic locations throughout the palace. Edward Seymour, already effectively ruling England, looked up from a document he was signing. "Ah, Piers, the records?" Thomas presented the 2 volumes with a bow. "The official chronicle and the medical observations, my lord, as maintained under His late Majesty's direction." Hertford flipped through them briefly. "And the other journal, the private one?" "His Majesty commanded it be destroyed upon his death," Thomas replied, meeting Hertford's gaze steadily. "As his faithful servant, I carried out his final wish." A flash of anger crossed Seymour's face. "That was not your decision to make." "Forgive me, my lord, but it was precisely my decision. As groom of the Stool and keeper of the royal records, His Majesty's intimate personal details were entrusted to my discretion." For a tense moment, Thomas thought Hertford might order him searched or arrested. But the Earl had too many pressing matters to deal with a stubborn servant over a journal he couldn't prove existed. "Your services will not be required by the new king," Hertford said coldly. "You may apply to the Queen Dowager if she'll have you. Otherwise, you'll receive 1 month's final wages." After 15 years, I'd have expected more loyalty to the crown rather than to a dead man. Thomas bowed deeply, hiding both his relief and his resentment. "The crown has my complete loyalty, my lord, as does His Majesty King Edward VI. I merely fulfilled my last duty to his father." Dismissed with a curt nod, Thomas departed the royal apartments for the final time. As he passed through corridors already buzzing with news of the king's death, he noticed how quickly Henry's fearsome presence was fading. Courtiers who would have trembled at the king's frown yesterday now spoke his name casually, already focusing on currying favour with the new powers. Outside in the late January air, Thomas paused in a secluded corner of the privy garden. From his doublet he withdrew the true journal, the record of a king's most private sufferings. He hesitated for a moment, then broke the spine, tearing out several key pages that he carefully folded and tucked back into his clothing. The rest he fed page by page into a small brazier kept burning to warm the garden sentries. The parchment curled and blackened, 15 years of royal bowel movements reduced to ash and smoke. As the final page dissolved into embers, Thomas reflected on his uniquely intimate service to the most formidable king England had ever known. He alone had seen Henry VIII stripped of all majesty, had witnessed the divine right of kings revealed as nothing more than failing flesh and mortal waste. He alone knew certain truths that history would never record. How Henry had wept when told of Catherine Howard's infidelities. How he had called for his mother in feverish delirium. How he had admitted, in his final hours, that Anne Boleyn had never bewitched him. Thomas Piers, once the second most important man in England, was now just another displaced servant in a court already forgetting his royal master. Within a week, his small chamber would be reassigned. Within a month, his name would fade from court gossip. Within a year, few would remember who had attended Henry VIII in his most private moments. Only Thomas himself would carry those memories, and the carefully preserved pages that proved Anne Boleyn's witchcraft had been a convenient lie. As he left the garden, a crier was already proclaiming throughout the palace, "The king is dead! Long live the king!" Thomas smiled sadly. They meant young Edward, of course. But Henry, massive, vital, terrifying Henry, was already becoming a ghost, a legend, rather than the suffering, stinking, all-too-human creature Thomas had tended. His Majesty never spoke of Thomas Piers again, but someone still had to clean the chair. Historical side effects disclaimer. Groom of the Stool edition. This story is for entertainment purposes only. Please do not attempt to recreate any Tudor-era sanitation procedures without modern gloves and emotional support. Side effects may include excessive loyalty to monarchs with digestive issues, increased familiarity with royal anatomy, deeply unwanted job security, and unsolicited career advice from your toilet. Not suitable for readers with a sensitive nose, a weak stomach, or a belief in the separation of throne and throne. Repeated exposure may lead to compulsive bowing, intimate knowledge of Tudor fiber intake, and the haunting realization that you're technically in charge of royal output. Use of this story may result in unwanted proximity to monarchy, over-identification with historical enablers, and a profound fear of being too competent at the wrong task. If you experience symptoms of political constipation or courtly gaslighting, consult a physician or a food taster. Contents may be historically accurate but emotionally unflushable.